this point. And instead, I'm going to introduce Dr. Michael McPherson. Mike is the 5th president of the Spencer Foundation. Prior to that, where he arrived in 2003, about 10 years ago, he served as president of McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is a really high-quality liberal arts college. And Mike is an economist by background. He has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and an MA and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, a place which is known for economics. And he spent many years at Williams College, where he was dean of faculty and head of the economics department, and a longtime member of the academic community. He's a well-known author. He's also co-author and editor of several books, including College Access, Opportunity or Privilege, Keeping College Affordable, Economic Analysis, Moral Philosophy, and Public Policy. And he was a founding co-editor of the journal Economics and Philosophy. He served as a trustee of the College Board, the American Council on Education, the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts. He's been a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study and a senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. Mike, would you come up and tell us what we should be thinking about here?
I'm really happy to be here, and I thank Rick very much for inviting me. I got to know Olin fairly early because of a project that the Spencer Foundation was supporting through the work of Richard Light at Harvard University. Olin was one of about a dozen, mostly undergraduate liberal arts colleges, who joined in a project to attempt to introduce an innovation of one kind or another within their institution, and then actually figure out whether the intervention was having an impact, and then if it was, to figure out how to keep it going. That is, how to actually build a culture of evidence is a phrase that I like in thinking about that. And Olin signed up, and I mean, you guys just shot the lights out compared to basically everybody else. I mean, the amount of creativity, innovation, the absolute engineering-driven determination to measure this damn stuff, really, everybody was excited. I mean, you know, when you hear about Olin, if you come and visit this place, as I've done, you just think, you know, where can I sign up? This is one of the real lights of American higher education, and so anything I can do to be helpful, I'm certainly willing to do. So I want to say, these are going to be somewhat random reactions to Rick's, I think, really excellent paper. And the first thing he said is, look, this is complicated. And so many people don't want to hear that. It's absolutely right that we complicate it more than we need to. And private higher education is a real source of that complication because of the very complicated way we determine student aid. And if you ever spend some time reading the letters of offer that explain people's aid packages, and you read 6 or 8 of those in a row, you see that everybody is using salesman-y language to kind of, not everybody, I'm sure, but often you see it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on. And that excess complication, greater transparency would do a lot to help with that. But the underlying realities are complicated, and it's a huge mistake to try to simplify those away. Public higher education is a very different deal from private higher education in terms of the way that it gets financed and the way that the finances are changing, as Rick had noted. And if we're not patient enough to actually try to grasp the topic, then reckless generalizations like everybody is drowning in debt, when in fact 30% of the people who get BAs don't borrow at all in college. You need to draw some of these distinctions, I think, if you're going to make progress in thinking about the issues. Rick and I have gone back and forth some about the earnings question. And I think it's important to put that earnings question in what I think of as the right context. You know, I drove here this morning from Cambridge, and in this absolutely gorgeous morning, this beautiful campus, I parked in the President's Visitor parking spot, which I hope was not designated for one of you, and looked around this campus, looked at these beautiful buildings, the quiet, the calm, the sense of dedication. I gotta say, the first thing, it was not the first thing I thought of is, wow, I'll bet these kids are gonna make a lot of money. Yeah, that's not at heart what this kind of experience is about. That's not what brings people to great universities and colleges. What brings them is hope. And what brings them is belief in a future for themselves and for their society. And they're going to be in a position to make the future different and better from the past. It's important to reassure people on the earnings side. You know, very few of us have the kind of wealth that can say, I'm going to spend 4 years doing something that's cool, and I don't care whether I'm ever going to be able to pay for it. That's not the way people live. We need to know that this is not a crazy step, that it's not going to leave us impoverished, drowning in debt, the rest of our lives being miserable because we had great 4 years. But I like to think of the earnings facts as basically reassurance. That is, it'll be okay. You know, we know that people who get BAs from good colleges and universities do well in life. It's probably true, although, of course, the data are never perfect, and one of the bad features of data is they're always about the past. And you're going to have to go live the future where you don't really know what relative earnings will turn out to be. But it's probably true that engineers, on balance, are likely to be better off financially than people in most other lines of endeavor. I don't think that's very important. It's much more important to know that engineers will be okay, that they'll be able to do these things that they love and do well, and that great idea of thinking, learning to think like an engineer and make things that help people accomplish things they want to accomplish. That's why we want people to do it. If it turned out that for some reason, all of a sudden, it turned out you made more money as a historian than you did as an engineer, I know that's a fantasy. I don't think Olin would say, oh man, we bet on the wrong horse, we're going to turn into a history college. Right? You believe in what you're doing, and you want to know you're not being stupid to do it. Now, are historians, are people who major in history as undergraduates being stupid in doing so? Actually, there's very little evidence that that's true. Your average BAs do very well relative to people who don't have BAs. The unemployment rate for people with BAs is about is about half as high as the unemployment rate for people with less education. The earnings differences really come about in the 1930s, in your 30s, not in your 20s. I think it's a disaster to look at starting salaries to make these choices. It just makes no sense at all. You graduate from Yale with a degree in economics, and as my friend Morty put it, you spend 2 years at TFA before you go to Goldman and cash in. Right? You're going to look at that TFA salary and say Yale doesn't pay? A lot of people are going to come out of college and get a really crappy job, or they're going to get a job they hate. They're going to change jobs. People change jobs like crazy up to age 30. The idea that that is going to predict what you're going to be making when you're 40 years old, that's just a mistake. You need to look at a longer period of time. There's another hazard in overdoing the emphasis on relative salaries. You can make more money as an engineer. On average, engineers make more money than liberal arts majors. Let's say they do that over a lifetime, which is probably true, but we could always have better evidence than we have. That's nice to know. But should that guide you toward becoming an engineer? You know, NBA players make more money than economists, but nobody would think I would have been smart to try to go into the NBA, right? So engineers require certain talents and certain dispositions and certain things they like to do. If you push people into engineering because of the relative salary, they may not make that average salary. So you can't really base career decisions on those kinds of averages. You need to pay attention to what fits for individuals. So I think we don't talk as well about this as we should, and I do think the right way to think about it is less, is college the way to get rich, and more, is it safe to go to college? Is it going to work out well so that you can have a good life and you can pay for your kids' college education and so on? Now, there are no guarantees in this economy. Absolutely no guarantees. But your odds are a hell of a lot better if you get a BA than if you don't. And you'll probably have, you know, an earlier time to buy a second car if you're in engineering than in something else. But it's not going to be a disaster unless you go to a disastrous place or you borrow disastrous amounts of money, which some people do, but most people don't. So that's the context in which I like to think about returns to education. One big thing on the cost of higher education that Rick brushes up against but doesn't really elaborate, which I think is illuminating, is what William Bowen and William Baumol came up with originally in the context of the performing arts about, it must be like 50 years ago. I'm maybe the only person in the room who actually can remember what the world was like 50 years ago. Here's what they described as the cost disease. If you think of something like the live performance of an orchestra, it's very hard to have technical improvements in live performance. That, for example, you can't play Beethoven's Seventh in half the time, right? It's going to take the same number of musicians, it's going to take the same amount of time, and most of the cost is going to be the cost of paying the musicians. You know, there's a hall and stuff like that, and engineers may figure out ways to make that hall work better or to build it more cheaply, but you're going to have talented players playing the music. That's the main cost. The rest of the economy consistently benefits from technical innovation and brings costs down, the other face of which is it brings productivity up. Those are the same thing. Performing arts don't get that advantage. And so the relative cost of performing arts relative to other kinds of products that are made available in society goes up over time. Now, traditionally, you could say that education suffers from the cost disease. The technology 50 years ago of higher education was basically a bunch of people in a room together learning something, and a major cost of that was the professor's time. And they didn't know how to teach mechanical engineering in half the time that they were already taking to do it, or economics in half the time. And so you had to keep paying these people more as productivity in the economy as a whole went up, but you couldn't get it back in productivity improvements. And that is a long-run reason why the relative price of college educations and of Broadway shows and concerts with live musicians have gone up over time relative to other things. Now, obviously, the big question here is, can technology solve that problem for us? Is it still the case that it takes people sitting together in a room and patiently learning from one another and from a teacher to become educated? Clearly, in music, we have figured out ways to get substitutes technologically for live performance, and DVDs and CDs and movies instead of Broadway, things like that. The fact is that there is still value in live performance, and people still want to go to the symphony, even though you can record it and reproduce it in your living room really very well now. In higher education, can you use MOOCs? Can you use Carnegie Mellon online tutors, internet tutors, and interactive computer systems to reduce those costs and get the same product? That is in many ways the problem of the age right now. This is the great hope for the public universities sector, which is not getting money from state governments anymore. And they need to find a way to deliver more stuff for the same amount of money or for less money. And technology is their hope for how to do that. Now, how do we want to think about that? Well, I think we want to think about it the way Woody Flowers thinks about it in a wonderful piece. You've probably written more pieces than the one I read about this, but we have to distinguish between training and education. I do think that there are parts of the higher education enterprise where you can really do a lot, potentially, with these technologies. If you think of a field like engineering, there is a whole set of skills and technical know-how that come into the work that needs to be accomplished. A great deal of technical know-how can be conveyed pretty well via computer and online. That's what Woody calls training. And I think, things like Microsoft courses in C++ and things like that are a good illustration of there's really a lot that can be done in this way. There's some very successful MOOCs about computer programming, which is, kind of a deeply self-referential thing when you think about it. But they really work well because you can give people instant feedback about whether their program, you just run it through a debugging program and you immediately know where they made a mistake. So you can get more skill at that. But, you're not going to invent Facebook through that. Now, I guess he didn't need 4 years at Harvard in order to pick up whatever he required. But education is much more about what you can do with those skills, how you can think well about what affordances there are out there that will enable you to take problems which you try to understand deeply. Right? I love the studio teaching at your place because it's about that. Take those problems in people's lives and figure out how to take all those techniques and apply them. That's education. Now, there may come a day, I would not say anything is impossible to do with technology, but man, we have no idea how we would do that now with technology. There are reasons why Google makes free food and stuff available to people at Google's offices all the time, so nobody ever goes home. Right? Google, of all places, should just have, there should be an employee in every city, and they should never have to see each other because it's all about electronics, except it's not. These ideas come about in the cafeteria. John Seeley Brown was the co-author of that great book about the secret life of information. That's how people learn how to repair Xerox machines, by the repair guys sitting in the cafeteria saying, oh, the 330F, everybody knows that thing, and then there's some little trick that they found out. We don't know how to educate people in Woody's sense online. We can do some stuff much more cheaply, and we should be really smart about that. And Olin is probably going to be much more creative about that than pretty much anybody else. But Olin's not going to close up this campus and say, we don't need that stuff. I think that's the promise and the limitation in the promise of online learning at this point. How did I do, Woody? Was that all right? One more thing I want to say in that vein. I'm pretty much done. This is consistent with what I was just saying. I think the problem of learning to think well is we don't understand very well how to teach people how to think well. What we kind of do is show them, we try to interact with them in ways that we're thinking well and hope they can kind of pick it up. I mean, it's sort of hard to operationalize that. But one thing that economists and engineers share is any economist will tell you the deepest purpose of undergraduate education in economics is to show you what it's like to think like an economist. And engineers say the same thing. You want to get that engineering mindset, that engineering, problem-solving, making things mentality. You want to learn how to think like an engineer. Now, I was at a fascinating meeting in Paris organized by OECD about this project they call a HALO, Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes. And they did this very ambitious thing. They took actually two fields, economics and engineering. They were generic about what kind of engineering. And they developed very ambitious examinations in those fields. And they got universities in 25 countries to participate in evaluating their juniors and seniors using these tests. First of all, just to see if they could pull it off, because this was all being done electronically globally. But then to see what they could find out. And the most interesting thing they found out was the tests in economics and engineering included some questions with free response that were about thinking like an engineer, thinking like an economist. That was what the experts who wrote the tests aimed to do. And the results were disastrous. People could solve the circuits, they could figure out whether well, you know, but the tensile strength and all that stuff, well, I don't know anything about that stuff, was adequate to hold up the thing it was supposed to support. They could figure out whether the bridge was designed properly. But if you asked them how to be creative with these tools, how to solve a problem, if you didn't draw the circuit for them, but asked them to describe the circuit in effect, how would you make a circuit to accomplish this? They were lost. And the worst, the Japanese. And this wonderful woman from Japan described that they are going to transform engineering education in Japan. At least it's her intention and the intention of her ministry to do that. She said, you know, our students loved those questions. And their reaction was, why don't you teach us how to do that? All you do is teach us how to pass the highly standardized licensing exams in Japan to qualify as an engineer. Now, I have no firsthand knowledge of whether this woman was talking through her hat because I don't know anything about engineering in Japan. But I thought that was a striking description of what we really should be aiming at in higher education and why we all need to learn from places like Olin, which take that responsibility seriously. The last thing I want to say, although I'm happy to chat, is there is simply no way we can solve the problems facing higher education without fixing healthcare. In fact, you could replace higher education with any other problem facing the country. You know, the way we're going in 50 years, half of the GDP will go to healthcare. Among the reasons states are defunding higher education is they're funding Medicaid. There's a really clear, sharp trade-off between those things. We can't think expansively about how to make higher education better or how to make elementary and secondary education better because we feel broke. And we feel broke ultimately because of the continual drive toward higher costs in healthcare. I have no idea what to do about that, but it is the 600-pound gorilla in every conversation about public policy in the country. So that's all.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I just want to get...
Okay, good. Get your copy.